Hello, everybody. My name is Katarina Bolemant, and today I will lead you through the webinar about what's new in MidPoint 4.7. At the beginning, we will look at which features and improvements is MidPoint 4.7 bringing, and then we will go through deprecations, removals, and supported platforms in 4.7. At the end, we will have a short look into the next version 4.8, which is currently under full speed development. MidPoint 4.7 is a feature release with 1 year support. It was named after Katarina Johnson. The name was chosen based on the correlation between Katarina's work and main feature simulations implemented in MidPoint 4.7. Besides simulations, MidPoint 4.7 brings another major feature called object marks, improvements for IGA reporting, password reset, and many other smaller features, mainly related to user experience. Let's start with simulations and why they might be interesting for you. The main purpose of the simulation is to predict what would happen if. In other words, they can provide different safe what-if analyses. Why safe? Because if you run simulation, no changes are executed. They are stored separately from production data. The benefit is that they can be used for analysis, so you can see what changes will be executed, which users will be processed, what accounts will be deactivated, and so on. When you see something unexpected or something you don't like, you don't have to worry. Until you run full synchronization, your data is safe, because so far, no changes have been executed. In addition, you can run simulations as many times as you like. Each simulation run will create its results with its statistics and metrics. So before you really execute the changes in production environment, you can test the configuration one more time. You can look at simulation as a safe way to test your configuration one more time in production environment before you finally give a green light to go live. Because let's be honest, the best testing environment is the production. No matter how hard we try to have pre-production or test environments, they will never be the same, and the least difference might mean disaster. Since simulations can give the actual and detailed view about what is going to happen in the system, and this view can be exported, it also gives a method how to communicate with the stakeholders and build trust between MidPoint and them. There are some common scenarios where the simulations might be helpful. Let's start with the first one. Every time new system is integrated with MidPoint, you need to correlate existing users with the users in the system. In MidPoint, you need to configure correlation rules based on which the users are matched. How the correlation rule should look is defined by its stakeholder. And now imagine, you configure the rules, how it was expected, and now you run simulation for these correlation rules. As a result, you see that most of the accounts are orphaned. They don't have any owner in MidPoint. And that is strange. You will need to investigate what happened. So you can open a simulation result and make analysis of those orphaned accounts. You might find out that the correlation rule can be improved. For example, that if you add rule for matching users based on email address and name, you will be able to correlate more accounts. So you do it and you run the simulation again. Now you can see that some of the orphan accounts have the owner and can be matched with existing users in MidPoint. Another good example might be simulation of reconciliation. Imagine that you need to do a reconciliation with the target system connected to MidPoint. The target system is sometimes managed manually by admins, so there might be changes you don't know about. For example, changes which would lead to the activation of some users, losing accesses to some application, changing login names, and so on. You are careful because in past you had a bad experience, therefore you decide to run the simulation first, which is very good decision because after running it, you see the detailed metrics, statistics, and information about changes being executed. If there is anything suspicious, you don't have to reconcile the target system. You can provide export to stakeholder and ask them to fix the problems. As mentioned earlier, every simulation run generates the simulation's result with details about changes being executed. To make the simulations usable, there need to be possibility to comfortably review those changes, to see the list of users being affected, metrics, and statistics. Therefore, we added the possibility to review the result of simulation using graphical user interface in MidPoint or export them with predefined or custom report. Similarly, as there is a functionality to preview changes when making any changes for users using MidPoint graphical user interface, it is now possible to run preview for single account import. So even before you run the full simulation for import, you can first try few accounts manually. Example of such preview run is shown in the picture. If you can wait, you can start with simulation tutorial described at docs.evolveum.com. Simulations are a great feature, and even more great is that they can be combined with another great feature called object marks. What and what for are object marks then? Imagine you run simulation. As a result, you see that your CEO will lose access to 3 applications. That is strange because you don't expect CEO to lose any access. If anything, he or she should gain new accesses. Therefore, you decide that in the full reconciliation run, you don't want MidPoint to do anything with the CEO identity. You want to avoid the situation that your phone will ring and angry CEO will complain that he cannot access what they are supposed to. Another example might be the result of the correlation simulation from the example mentioned earlier. New target system was integrated and we had to tune our rules how the existing MidPoint users are matched with the users on that system. After the first version of the correlation rule, you could see that 90% of users weren't matched. But you didn't expect such a big number of orphaned accounts. You have to make a decision what to do with this. Usually, this is something that takes time, and if you don't want to wait, but rather you want to process other objects, you can say MidPoint that the destiny of those accounts will be decided later, and the reconciliation should ignore them for now. MidPoint offers some of the objects marked by default since MidPoint 4.7. This isn't the final set, and you can specify your own. Simply create new mark and define policy what can and what cannot be done in MidPoint encounter object with such mark. One more example for this new feature is well-known protected accounts. For years, it is possible to define policies in MidPoint which accounts are considered protected, so MidPoint mustn't execute any changes on them. Since MidPoint 4.7, additionally to protected accounts defined by policies, you can manually mark other accounts as protected. MidPoint won't execute any changes related to these accounts unless you unmark them. Use object marks for letting MidPoint know what is allowed to do with accounts. For example, can they be synchronized? Can the inbound mappings be executed? Make reports, dashboards based on the marks and deliver it to customers so they can better see what their data quality is. Another significant improvement coming with MidPoint 4.7 is regarding IGA reporting. It is related to the very common and useful report about who has access to what and why. Even though it was possible to see that information also in older MidPoint versions, it wasn't very straightforward. Such report is very important for different types of users, whether role managers, security officers, or administrators. The report is designed to provide means for analyzing user access, identifying unnecessary access, analyze access per scope of users. The governance system is about having good overview of the data in the system, and so is MidPoint. This functionality is now available in MidPoint graphical user interface on users' details under All Accesses panel. The search possibility is crucial for the view, and it is possible using MidPoint query language. Besides the possibility to see the accesses per user, new report was created and added as default one to MidPoint. It is possible to modify search criteria and columns of the report according to your need. Since MidPoint 4.7, it is possible to set different reset password flows for different users. This feature is possible thanks to MidPoint's active subscriber. Each password reset flow consists of the same high-level steps. First, the user has to request password reset. Then, the user has to be identified and verified that they are who they claim to be. And only after that, the password can be reset. First part is obvious. There need to be some mechanism how the user makes the request to reset password. In MidPoint, it is the reset password link on login page. The last step, where user is allowed to reset password, is also obvious. Currently, MidPoint supports only manual reset, so the user has to choose their new password. The second step, regarding identification and verification, is, however, interesting, and this is where the improvements were made. In older versions, it was possible to define common verification option. So, if the password reset was allowed and configured to use magic link sent to the user's email, all users had to have email set, and if they requested password reset, the magic link was sent there. There wasn't possibility to differentiate the password reset mechanism in such a way that, for example, guests will use security questions for verification, and employees will use magic link together with their employee number validation for verification. Since MidPoint 4.7, this is possible. So, for example, you can have one password reset flow for guests, which might consist of following steps. After requesting password reset, user is prompted to make an identification. In other words, in this case, they need to fill in their login name. After that, they are requested to answer the security questions. If the answers are correct, user is allowed to set new password. At the same time, there is another password reset flow applicable for employees. The beginning of the flow is the same. After requesting password reset, user is prompted for identification with their login name. But after identification, as at that point we know that the user is not guest but employee, user is sent magic link to their email. After clicking on the link, additional verification is requested from the user. In this case, it is verification of their employee card ID. Only after this verification, user is allowed to set their new password. MidPoint 4.7 brings, of course, more. Let's briefly dive into the more technical details of mentioned features to see other related improvements. For mentioned IGA report, we needed few smaller improvements. As you saw, when the report is generated, there is a role for each access, or even more, for each origin of the access. Therefore, if the same access originates from two different business roles, there will be two roles for such access. To support this, new configuration property was added for subreports. It can be used every time we want to produce separated rows for each value of multi-value property. To be able to quickly provide information about all accesses and why the user has those accesses, we needed to store the data containing this information. We decided to use provenance metadata concept known from the MidPrivacy project. Each access, represented in MidPoint as role membership ref, now contains additional information, so-called metadata, such as when the access was effectively activated, if the access originates from another business role, and so on. And to be able to search for accesses in MidPoint, we introduced new type of search. This search returns list of references. Currently, only searching for role membership ref and link ref are supported. To support flexible flows for password reset, we needed to extend the flexible authentication feature. One extension is that new modules were added. These are focus identification, attribute verification, and hint module. All those modules can be used only in combination with other modules with stronger security. Even when all three are defined, but there are no other modules with stronger security, authentication won't be successful. Focus identification module can be used to find a user in MidPoint. Hint module can be used to provide hint to the user, so maybe they will remember the password and don't need to reset it. And attribute verification module can be configured to request any attribute value from user and compare it with the value stored in MidPoint. In some cases, there is a need to automatically skip module. For example, user hasn't set hint yet, therefore we don't even want to bother him with this step during password reset. But if another user trying to reset password has the hint set, it should be shown to him. For this reason, new configuration property called accept empty was introduced. However, only hint and security questions module currently supported. More significant improvement related to flexible authentication is possibility to define chain of the modules which need to be executed during authentication. Inspired by pluggable authentication module, also for flexible authentication modules, it is possible to define their necessity. Since MidPoint 4.7, requisite, required, sufficient, and optional necessity levels are supported. It is possible to define different required, requisite, or sufficient modules. The overall status of the authentication is evaluated based on the result of each executed module. For example, if there is any required module in the chain which evaluation failed, the overall authentication status will be failure. To be able to provide different password reset options for different users, improvements for handling and evaluating security policy needed to be changed. Whether password reset will be allowed or not, and which authentication modules will be used for verification of the user, is configured in security policy. In older MidPoint versions, only global security policy was considered when it came to password reset. But since MidPoint 4.7, also security policy defined for organizational units and archetypes are considered. One improvement is the possibility to define security policy related to archetype. Another improvement is that all the security policies are now merged. It still applies that the password reset might be enabled only on a global level, so in the security policy reference from system configuration. It is influenced by the fact that in the time When we need to show or hide password-breasted link, we don't know much about the user. This link is present on the login page. But after user fills first information about themselves, for example, focus identification module is used, we know exactly who the user is. Therefore, after such identification, we can find and merge all the security policies applicable for the user. This way, you can have different flows for guests or employees, for example, expecting that the guests and employees are archetypes or they are members of different organizational units. As usual, MidPoint 4.7 brings also improvements in graphical user interface. Major improvement is regarding role creation, where a new wizard for creating application role and business role was introduced. Panel for viewing changes, either executed or being executed, was reworked to provide better experience. The aim was to provide more human-readable overview about what's going to be changed. You can see examples in the picture. Regarding deprecations, removal, and incompatible changes, there were no much of them in 4.7, but let's have a quick look at them. ConID result handlers are disabled by default. Result handlers were enabled by default in previous MidPoint versions, as this was default by ConID framework. However, most connectors do not need result handlers, and sometimes they may even be harmful when used with some connectors. Therefore, the default setting was changed in MidPoint 4.7. So if you need to use them, you need to explicitly enable ConID result handlers for the connectors that need them. If the connector doesn't need any result handlers, no action is required. One of the connectors which required these result handlers was a CSV connector, but this was changed in the version 2.6, which is bundled with MidPoint 4.7. Also, new version of LDAP connector bundle was released and bundled with MidPoint 4.7. This version fixes a bug with large integer numbers. Resource schema of LDAP and AD resources need to be refreshed for the connector to operate correctly. Scripts using object variable mode set to prism reference should be provided with real value of the reference. However, in some cases, they weren't provided with the real value, but with the prism reference value instead. This was fixed, and now the real value is always provided. So you will need to check your scripts, and if you use object variable mode property, adapt them accordingly. For full list of deprecation removals and incompatible changes, please also see the release notes related to MidPoint 4.7. MidPoint 4.7 for production deployments is supported only on Linux. Production deployments in Windows are supported only in LTS versions. Recommended Java is OpenJDK 17. MidPoint 4.7 can be run only as standalone deployment. Explicit war deployment was removed in previous versions. If you haven't migrated yet to native repository implementation for PostgreSQL, we recommend to do it as soon as possible. New features, including simulations, are not supported for generic repository implementation, only for native repository. Also, support for generic implementation was deprecated some time ago, and the overall plan is to remove it eventually. If you have any questions or concerns about migration to native repository implementation, feel free to contact us. And finally, what are the plans for 4.8, which will be next LTS version? The biggest area we are investing in is security. First of all, we want to eliminate all the performance bottlenecks related to applying security policies. This will help with performance of reports, generation, executing mappings with complex scripts, for example, when get object or search objects are used. It can also improve overall GUI in performance. Another part of security is regarding cases and work items authorizations. We want to provide easier and more flexible ways to configure them. Also, we plan to finish expression profile, so it will be possible to define which functions can be used in scripts in mappings, for example. And last but not least, we will introduce automatic scanning for vulnerabilities and security issues. Big feature we plan to deliver with 4.8 is role mining, mainly around analyzing accesses, application roles, and suggesting business roles accordingly. Since 4.8 is an LTS version and there will be migration paths from the latest 4.4 and 4.7, we will improve also our upgrade tool, currently Ninja. The aim is to help mainly with smaller to medium deployments to provide more automatic way, better validation of objects in DB, automatic migration of configuration where possible, also improve reporting of failures and the whole process. So for example, you can better see what was executed, what is currently being executed, how many failures there were, how many successes there were, and so on. And of course, as usual, we plan to invest more to better user experience. Thank you for your attention. You can also follow us on our social media for further information, or feel free to ask anything at info@evolveum.com.